This is To the Right House, a new podcast series by the Global Campus of Human Rights. From scepticism to hope, from utopia to empathy, we discuss human rights, riding waves, but also signalling where the light is. This podcast was recorded in Venice, Italy, on the island of Lido, at the Global Campus headquarters.
Hello out there. Welcome to the Global Campus podcast series on engaging with human rights skepticism. Today is the fifth and final session in our podcast series. Our topic for today is the most fundamental and perhaps most challenging expression of human rights skepticism, namely the question of whether the very concept of universal human rights is at all meaningful. We refer to this as ontological skepticism, as it raises questions about the reality of human rights. Are human rights real, and in what sense? Or are they fictions, mere constructs, instruments of oppression? This raises questions about universalism, about our common humanity, and about the historical legacy that over centuries has crystallized in the Universal Human Rights International Law Framework. I'm George Ulrich, Academic Director of the Global Campus and host of the podcast. With me today to tackle these profound questions is Professor Kostas Dousinas. He's Professor of Law and Philosophy at Birkbeck University of London. He was founder of the Birkbeck School of Law, the Birkbeck Institute of Humanities, and the School of Law at the University of Cyprus. Kostas Dousinas was also a Syriza MP in Greece from 2015 to 2019. His primary focus over many years has been on critical legal studies. In the course of his distinguished scholarly career, Dousinas has been an early scholar of human rights, but also an early critic in a constructive sense. He has powerfully raised questions about the humanity as a parameter of exclusion as well as inclusion, and also about the possibility of human rights colluding with dominant economic and political interest in the neoliberalistic and post-colonial world. Dousinas' publications include a trilogy of seminal books called The End of Human Rights, Human Rights and Empire, and The Radical Philosophy of Human Rights. In today's discussion, we'll focus primarily on arguments presented in the third volume of this trilogy, The Radical Philosophy of Human Rights, which, by the way, includes material separately published as 7 theses on human rights, which have been standard reading assignments in seminars that we've been conducting here at the Global Campus for several years. Some of the main themes of the book have to do with conceptual analysis of the legal person, dignity, the self, paradoxes of human rights, and also, in the final part, the revival of the claim to a right to resistance, indeed revolution. We'll try to touch on all of these aspects of the argument, but first I would like to invite you, Kostas, to share with us a short reflection on what motivated you to undertake this critical examination of human rights and human rights law over the course of at least 20 years or more. Please.
Thank you very much, George. And I'm really honored and delighted to be discussing with you in this series of podcasts. And I think they're making a very important contribution to our understanding of human rights. Now, you asked me how I got to that kind of work and these books that you referred to. And I suppose the most important reason is my personal history. I was a student of law during the brutal dictatorship in my home country of Greece between 67 and 74. And I joined the student resistance at the time, was roughed up by the regime. And I was really delighted when the Council of Europe expelled Greece in 1969, after a case was brought to the European Court of Human Rights by Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and the Netherlands. Indeed, Russia is the second country to be expelled from the Council of Europe. It was done earlier this year. Now, resistance, which goes back to my personal history, is a main topic and the main interest for me in my work. And indeed, the resistance of ordinary Ukrainians today is a reminder that humanity always emerges through acts of resistance. And natural rights, the predecessor of human rights, was, of course, again, the result of revolutions. Now, the second part, which is the more kind of intellectual root of my work, is that after the end of the dictatorship, I went to London to carry out my doctoral research at the LSE. And pretty soon I encountered a certain theoretical or conceptual difficulty. Human rights are perhaps the most important, or one of the most important liberal institutions. But if you look at liberal legal and political theory and philosophy, I think they actually leave quite a lot of standard social theory out of it. They're really highly problematic. What you learn if you go to sociology, to politics, anthropology, any of the standard social sciences in the first year is, what it's been called the three major continents of thought. And they include Hegel and Marx, and of course, dialectic, struggle, and so on. Nietzsche and Foucault, will and power, and of course, Freud and the post-Freudians, psychoanalysis and subjectivity. And none of this appears in any of the standard textbooks, theories in jurisprudence, and so on. And we have somehow an erasure of 200 years of social theory, and most important and extremely, I think, central theorists of political philosophy go back to the 18th century, to the social contract, the categorical imperative. They deal with people as if they're fully control of themselves and so on. And I think, when I saw that, when I was reading all these people, all these philosophers of the great social theory, Western social theory, while at the same time doing my PhD on human rights, at some point I decided that, I should put the two together. And this is, in a sense, what my project has been, to basically work out how we reached where we are today. I mean, what does it mean to say that we're human? What it means to be human? So to that extent, this kind of work tries, whether it succeeds is a different question, to work out a genealogy of human rights and of the human, to understand how law and rights and human rights are key contributors, they're key tools in the creation of the human person, of the human individual, of the human. So that rights, I would claim, I think this is one of my key conclusions in this work, rather than being given to humans on account of their humanity, because we're all human, we have rights, it is rights, the types of rights that are given to particular people in particular ages, in particular countries, societies, and so on, that create the human, create the self, ourselves. And in doing that, rights, human rights, the law, in constructing you and me, what it means to be a human in a particular place at a particular time, they also distribute people, humans, across a spectrum of full humans, of lesser humans, and at the end also of some people who are excluded from humanity.
So maybe this is a good place to pause. Thanks so much for these introductory reflections, which in fact take us right into the first part of the first several chapters of your radical philosophy of rights, where you're analyzing the genealogy, as you say, of the legal person, but also concepts such as dignity, self-subjectivity, and the role of rights in these contexts. You also have occasional contrasts with pre-modern ways of configuring similar issues and topics, and I find it all extremely enlightening and challenging. Now, if I understand your argument correctly, what you were telling us about how legal personhood is created by society and in many ways, as you say, is distributed, and some have more entitlements than others through the allocation of rights. If I understand correctly, you contrast this with another concept that runs through modern European history, the moral self, which is the subject of Kantian dignity, and in many ways also the implicit subject of the implicit human in the international human rights framework, at least as I understand it. So you have a universal human self, and then you have the legal person, the socially created identity that has differential value and access and entitlement and so on. How do you see the tension between those two different ways of interpreting or configuring the idea of the human?
Yeah, sure. Yes, there is a tension. There is also a configuration, like you put it, a coming together. And in a sentence, my conclusion is that the idea of the human, of the self as free, rational, equal with others, which is very much part of the human rights tradition, is the outcome of a long historical journey that goes from Jerusalem to Athens to Rome to the 18th century revolutions and, of course, the contemporary declarations of rights. So the legal person first. The idea of the person and the term persona in Rome initially was a theatrical mask. The mask that actors were putting on stage in order to adopt a particular character and so on. So it was the mask that ritual and theatrical performance puts on people, but then Roman law transferred that function from the stage to the human. And the idea of the legal person, of persona in Latin, was created in Rome. And of course, it was at that point, and I think still today, both a general predication, a general characteristic of some people, but at the same time, a tool or a way of distinguishing between masters and slaves, between senators and politicians and citizens, between people with certain dignitates. Dignity starts its life as dignitates, as the privileges, the honors, the public recognition that some people have and others do not. So that is the beginning of the legal person, of the persona, as a legal term, which also goes parallel to that idea of differentiated dignities, dignitates. And then, of course, Christianity changes that. The person in Christianity, which follows the three persons of the Godhead and so on, becomes something of a metaphysical idea, something that brings together body and soul and turns the human into the image of God, into the reflection of God. Man was made in the image of God and so on. So that is the first turn of a conception that distinguishes legal persona into a moral person, into someone who, first of all, has the possibility of universalization, although not so much in the Middle Ages, where, of course, only the Christians had those characteristics, but has that possibility, that potentiality in it. And then, of course, when with modernity, the idea of the person now acquires a secular character, most characteristically in Kant, in Immanuel Kant and the metaphysics of Kant, then, of course, at that point, the person becomes what we would recognize even today the autonomous person who makes rational choices, has reason, acts morally, accepts responsibility for her acts, and so on and so forth. So that is, in a sense, the way through which what initially was distinguishing things and people becomes a universal characteristic. However, and that, of course, then moves on into the French and American revolutionary documents, which extend personality to all. Everyone is born free and equal in rights. That is the key claim of the French and American revolutions. And therefore, that idea of a moral personality becomes the quality of all humans. It is the attribute of the moral or the rational part of the human.
Sure.
The legal person, however, continues her life. The legal person is the point of contact between law and concrete humans. The legal person is a combination of rights and duties, of responsibilities and privileges. And of course, it is not the human. It is a different conception, a different configuration of relations and abilities, which is parallel to the human. And indeed, many legal persons are not human. Historically, the corporation, I mean, the church first and then corporations were legal persons next to the limited number of humans who were. And today, of course, legal persons can become all kinds of entities, including robots and artificial intelligence and all the rest of it.
So yeah, yes. Maybe let me just to interject, but this I think is very, very clear and to me very challenging and interesting. So we have the tension between the legal persona and the universal moral self, that and we see it's the latter that's reflected in the claim also of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. That's our ideal, that's our vision. And yes. What you're saying is that the legal person that is the carrier of rights doesn't always reflect or match that type of universality. And of course, we've seen this. I remember quoting in a concept note for this podcast, Catherine McKinnon, who in the 1990s was very strongly saying that being a woman is not yet a name for being human. Simply saying that the legal framework does not address women as fully human, and as you were saying, that's true of many groups that are being marginalized and excluded in terms of legal personality throughout history and still today. And yes. But could one say that there is, at least within the human rights framework, an attempt to rectify these shortcomings and gaps? So I think that if you take international law, and someone like McKinnon may even have been a driver of this, she has been insisting on recognition of, for example, sexual violence within the international humanitarian law and criminal law framework and so on. So there's an attempt at rectifying the deficit. Is that a fair point, or is there a chronic deficit, so to say, in the gap?
It is a fair point in the sense that the deficit, or the gap, as you would put it, between the universality, the moral universality of the person and the actual empirical rights and the actual empirical recognition of the status of the citizen, of the ordinary person in the world, that gap existed right from the beginning. In the French Declaration, the American Declaration, they say, as you repeat it also yourself from the Universal Declaration, everyone is born equal in dignity and rights. And at the same time, they are slaves, women have no political rights whatsoever, people without property have no political rights, and so on. So there is this gap. And human rights, you are right in saying, promises somehow to close the gap. And it has closed it in certain ways. I totally agree with you. And of course, Catherine McKinnon was key in turning rape and sexual violence into a crime against humanity that was recognized by the International Criminal Court and so on and so forth. This is absolutely true. But what I'm saying is that historically, this gap is there. It has not disappeared. I mean, obviously, more groups have been included in that idea of the moral personality, of the universal attributes of humanity and so on. But the gap is still there. It changes from time to time. And of course, it changes in according to the epoch, the age, and according to the society in which we live. But it is there. We see it all the time.
I know from your various writings that various groups that you're looking at is the sans-papiers, the people, stateless people, which of course are very vulnerable because they don't have a citizenship to protect their rights, which is embedded in the state-centric international human rights framework, that somehow you need protection of a state. Asylum seekers, migrants, and you're also mentioning, for example, prisoners in secret detention centers and so on. So a variety of groups, and I absolutely can see how the very right to be recognized as a subject of rights is in question and it's a blemish, and it's something shocking and deeply disturbing. Nevertheless, if I think of my colleagues working in the international human rights framework, whether it's as a special rapporteur against torture, criticizing facilities in Guantanamo Bay, or whether it's many other, human rights advocates, their life campaign is about calling attention to the deficiency in the implementation and realization of this universal ideal of human rights, and acting in very concrete ways of trying to, let's say, narrow or close that gap if at all possible.
You're right. And of course, I consider people like those you've mentioned, but even more importantly, people and young people today in the different social movements around the world who try to help those without citizenship, without recognition, without rights, in order to have a basic dignity. And I know you want us to come back to that term, a basic dignity. I'm totally in favor of that. I mean, in the country I'm currently resident, in Greece, the treatment of refugees coming from Syria over the last 5 or 6 years has been totally, I think, despicable is a strong term, totally unacceptable, particularly over the last 2 years. However, lots and lots of young people have gone out and shown solidarity and shown what it means really to be fighting for human rights, and the same over the pandemic with the solidarity towards the more vulnerable and so on and so forth. However, it seems to me, and that takes us to the key question that you posed, that the problem about this non-recognition of rights for certain categories of people, for certain categories of situations and so on, it's not just a kind of incidental difficulty that you generally have between grand ideas and their application, their actual enforcement in practice. It is something deeper than that, which I would put it for the purposes of our current point in this way. The idea of a universal humanity that creates human rights, gives it to people, and then people enjoy those rights, is logically, in a sense, unable to carry out this, because those universal human rights have to be delivered by the local policeman, the local government, the local judge, or the local, oligarch, who actually has the power to oppress and dominate people. In other words, while we have a universal and universalizable in the Kantian terms conception of morality, empirically, that has to be delivered not by some universal humanity that does not exist, but by local authorities, by local governments, local laws, local administrators and policemen and judges. And that kind of logical relationship, contact between the universal and the empirical means that in every instance where a particular society, a particular group, a particular ideology excludes certain people from the position of the fully human, the rights will be there as an ideal, but the reality will not be given to them. And unfortunately, we cannot overcome, we cannot transcend that position.
So I think just to maybe wrap up this initial part of the discussion, I would maybe say that from my point of view, I would grant that the split cannot be entirely overcome, but I'm not sure I see that as an argument against the ideal of universal and universalizable human rights. I would say we need it both as an ideal to work towards and as a critical standard to denounce blatant wrongs. And that's maybe where I'm not entirely. So I take your point and your argument, and I think it's very important for us. But I feel it's not really an argument against the international human rights framework so much as a reminder of never being complacent, so to say, or
If I may, just add that I don't argue against that framework. I keep calling it a paradox, that human rights are a paradox, that on the one hand create that sense of ideal, of some kind of horizon that we are going towards or aspiring to it and so on, but its reality can never match up. So that is slightly different from being against it.
Sure.
It's telling people that, listen, this is not the last utopia. This is not the only ideology in town that we have, sort of to march to its tune because there is nothing else. That is the point I'm making. Yeah. I'm not against. I could not be against. As I said, sort of I was someone who benefited hugely from human rights, and that's why I've been an activist, all my life. Yeah. But I think there's certain exaggerations, a certain triumphalism in some of the human rights writers, which I think gives their own impression to people.
No, a point well taken. I think it's also quite clear in your book that the insistence on correcting that what you call triumphalism is quite the dominant voice, and so sometimes I feel a need to let's say also remember the need for this critical perspective that I believe still the human rights framework provides exactly in relation to some of the deficits that you're pointing out. I would like to move us into the paradoxes and maybe there are many steps in between, but one of the key themes I think also of your work is the way in which the human rights framework is at best, let's say, effectively compatible with the neoliberalistic capitalist order, and so it coexists uncomfortably perhaps, but nevertheless with quite extreme global inequality and widening gaps between rich and poor, inclusion and exclusion, and so on. And one might even want to go a step further and say that it's not just a matter of coexistence, there's even some form of collusion, that the way in which the subject is configured in the legal language is a precondition in some ways for maintaining the market economy and so on. What would you say to that?
I think this is perhaps the most important contemporary issue and question about the international, particularly the international human rights regime. You see, the human rights obviously won after 1989, after the end of the Soviet Union and so on, because of course the Cold War, the second part of the Cold War had been presented as having human rights as a key kind of bone of contention between the Westerns, the so-called Western part of the world, and the Eastern part and so on. So they won. And then we have a period of some 30 years in which three other aspects of international and domestic life coincided with this victory of human rights. First, what the economists call neoliberalism. The idea that the market is what is the best, indeed the only proper principle of distribution, and the market principle should be introduced in all aspects of social life, not just in terms of financial markets and so on. Secondly, what sociologists call globalization. We all understand that. And then political theorists also spoke about something they call the post-democratic condition. Post-democratic condition meaning that somehow, because social issues and social problems and questions are extremely difficult and technical and so on, they should not enter political discourse and political conflict and so on and compromises, but should be given to experts, technicians, who will give answers to them. So these three things, these three tendencies, extremely important, that have very much changed the way we live if we go back 30 or 40 years, have coincided with human rights. And this question has been now posed by many, I think, academics, intellectuals, writers, commentators. Are human rights, sort of this tradition of human rights just coinciding with these developments, or is it part of this new configuration of world and domestic life? Or to put it differently, is political liberalism, which is a hugely proud tradition, it's a tradition of the rights of man, or naturalized then of human rights, civil and political liberties, democratic freedoms, and so on. Is that kind of liberalism and the economic liberalism that has imposed austerity policies to Italy, to Greece, to Portugal, to the south of Europe, and of course, all over the world with the so-called Washington Consensus and all the rest of it, are these two things the same? Are they linked? No, they're not the same. I mean, obviously, they deal with different parts of life. Are they same? Are they linked? Now, of course, the initial impetus of natural rights and of human rights was the promotion of individual freedom against the state, against state interference. And individuals suffering from state oppression, from public power oppression, are the privileged, and quite rightly so, the privileged group. Civil and political liberties, the main tool of protection. However, when we move to the part of life which for most people in the world, and particularly the global south, is much more important, which is material prosperity and a global view of what it means to have a good life. There, human rights have not played a role, and if anything, in those neoliberal austerity policies that accompanied that period of human rights victory, human rights acceptance, one could say that, they had, at least in terms of a chronological coincidence, but perhaps also in terms of a certain causal connection, they had not a positive effect.
I mean, this is an argument that I take your point. There's an argument that is increasingly being made. We confronted a similar argument in some ways in a discussion with Samuel Moyn recently, and he is making and even going a step further, criticizing the economic, social, and cultural rights framework as not enough, as the title of one of his recent publications. I would again like to challenge that interpretation a bit, and I'll point to two considerations. One is that, I see also in your work a certain, what one can say, it's I don't want to say you're necessarily completely reviving or repeating the Marxian critique of the legacy of the French Revolution, but there's an element of that, seeing the individual underlying the man of the rights of man, or the human in the human rights framework, as someone who's atomized, individualized, self-centered, and fundamentally egotistical in a certain way. So not social, not member of a political community in a effective way. And, you know, I feel that this is in many ways not doing justice to the implicit ethos of human rights. As you were saying yourself, most of the human rights as they exist today are in many ways a legacy of struggle, of people claiming rights. And this, I think, is true both of civil political rights and economic, social, and cultural rights. You know, the economic, social, and cultural rights are the legacy of social movements, claiming some degree of minimum protections by society, decent working conditions, and so on and so forth. And I think to reduce this whole framework to a kind of self-centered individual agent of the market is not doing full justice to the framework. And I think similarly, the implicit ethos of human rights is in many ways it does reflect an element of social commitment, solidarity, wanting to empower people to take charge of their own destinies, which could also be a way of approaching the idea of the good life. You know, that it's not just a matter of passively enjoying material goods, it's a matter of being an agent in one's own sphere of action and architect of one's own destiny. And I think if you look at the whole catalog of international human rights, they're in all aspects are about empowering individuals to be active in the context they inhabit, and I see that as much more, so to say, than the sort of counterpart to a neoliberalistic, unequal capitalist economy.
Yeah. No, I take the criticism, and I think this is an extremely important issue in terms of how we move forward at this particular point in our history. But it seems to me that this kind of critique, the critique that myself and Sam more, and of course I would never agree with Sam that human rights is the last utopia. It is precisely not the last utopia. It is not a utopia. Utopia is something which is not yet, which is something to be achieved, which is something that goes into the idea of a good life, a fulfilled, completed life, and so on. But that is a different question. So it is important. It is important. Now, is individualism, particularly that kind of egotistical individualism, part of a certain conception, a dominant conception of human rights today? I would say that it is. It was, of course, back in the 18th century. It was in the 19th century when those kinds of individual political and civil freedoms and democratic freedoms did not exist. At that point, what you call the ability to act, as Michel Villet, the great legal historian, puts it, in pouvoir d'agir, to act, to make decisions, to be in the world. All that was absolutely crucial, and it is very much part of our modernity. This is modernity. There's no doubt about that. But once we move into the contemporary situation of the last 30 or 40 years, when human rights became the official ideology, then at that same period, market capitalism, a kind of aggressive looking towards my own interests and not caring very much about others, became at the same time extremely central. And if you look around the world, take the work of the great Indian theorist Upendra Baxi. He shows how property and trade-related rights provide a set of moral values and legal institutions which are necessary for economic globalization. You take an excellent work on the morals of human rights, recently published, which says that somehow human rights have become the moral component or the moral justification of the world dispensation. And of course, if you look at the recent wars, all recent wars, even Putin, the murderer Putin, is using a kind of human rights tradition, claiming that he went to Ukraine because the Russian speakers were being murdered, there were atrocities against them and so on. But at every recent war, all the way to, of course, Syria, it was there supposedly to protect human rights. So that is one side of the problem with international human rights. The other side is that, unfortunately, as I tell my students in London, but also in Greece, we have any number of human rights, from the Universal Declaration to all kinds of treaties, conventions, ILO treaties, and so on, claiming that we have a right to work. And then I turn around and I said, what could I say as a human rights expert and campaigner to the 40% of the young people in Greece or the 20% in Britain that do not have any work? So unless, the human rights tradition adopts a serious attitude, and of course the law more generally, towards the protection of those social and economic rights, things like the right to work, but also the right to health. We saw the huge difference between people in the advanced Western world and the third world over the pandemic. We saw the vaccination nationalism. We saw the fact that while in Western Europe up to 70% of people are fully vaccinated, in some parts of Africa we go back to 5%. This is a totally unjust world. If human rights is not prepared to own up to that and see how they can help it, then it seems to me it loses, to a certain extent, its raison d'etre.
Okay, but at the same time, you have, for example, now speaking of the right to health, one of the recent UN Special Rapporteurs on the right to health, like Anand Grover, for example, was devoting his entire mandate to identifying and criticizing exactly this point, from the perspective of Article 12 of the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So as to say, the sort of oscillation between seeing the rights framework as a critical resource and as a sort of complacent justification is not that clear cut, I think, in fact.
No, but I agree when you're saying that. But here, so let me say just one sentence, which is more general about law, not just rights, but also rights as legal rights. There is always a difference between the normative world, you could call it, of rights and laws and treaties and conventions and so on, and the empirical world where you and I live. There is a difference there. There is a little gap again between what all these documents and texts and norms, come together according to Kelsen. Of course, it is all very coherent, internally connected. One thing leads to another in a logical, argumentative sense, and so on. And then, of course, we have another world, which is the real world in which we live, and there is no link between the two. So, of course, it is important, and it is a critical resource, as you say, to have committees and reports, and indeed rights themselves. But that says quite little, not nothing, but little about what it means for people in the real world.
So I don't know if this properly, I take your point. I don't know if this properly summarizes, because I see somewhere in your, or repeatedly in fact in your work, you talk about the risk of rights becoming, like you were also saying, expert culture, becoming a technical framework that in fact depoliticizes politics in a sense. And what I'm arguing, I suppose, is to try to take rights seriously as a resource to overcome injustices within the political sphere, means in a certain sense repoliticizing rights and recapturing part of the struggle dimension that people like Christoph Heinz and Baxi as well, and many others have very strongly accentuated in their interpretation and in their work. I don't know if that's a fair way, but I would like to.
A great. Yeah.
I see the same, in fact, in relation to the moral dimension of rights. We were talking the agency aspect that. And as you know, I like very much the Martin Nussbaum's emphasis on linking rights with expanding human capabilities, which I see as a resource for becoming politically active in a sense. So there's an interpretation that I think is not entirely contrary to your understanding as well, but just accentuating from a little bit from the opposite point of view.
No, not at all. And actually, the work of Nussbaum and Amartya Sen, the capabilities sort of gender, in a sense, is presented as an alternative to the idea of well-being based just on rights and freedoms. It is a totally different one. And of course, in my kind of vocabulary, capabilities would also be linked with needs, with human needs, in which both the body and the soul, both parts of a human being, are part of it. But you did say something for me absolutely central: the repoliticizing of politics. This is absolutely a key, it seems to me, aspect, a key object, aspiration for all of us who work either as campaigners and movements or as writers and thinkers and so on with human rights. And the right to resistance is absolutely right at the heart of it. Resistance for me is a key characteristic of what it means to be human. I mean, the two major Genesis kind of stories, Adam and Eve, and of course, Prometheus in the Greek tradition, created humanity by defying the orders and the commands of the gods, of the higher authority, and so on and so forth. And everything we have today, every right, every facility, everything that we're proud for in our tradition is very much the result of struggle. And to that extent, when law and philosophy and the dominant part of the world tried repeatedly and even today to delete resistance from the annals of law, the annals of human rights and so on, it was playing a losing game, because irrespective of what the law says against disobedience, against resistance, even against revolution, they will always come back, like the repressed. You may ban it, you may punish people, who are carrying them out, but it will come back. Ukraine is a very good example. I can, give you a million examples, but I'm sure you know them yourself. That idea, that, human characteristic to resist power, whether it is public or private, and to put forward an idea of the well-being of the human that cannot be kept down, cannot be dismissed for too long. That is, for me, a key aspect of the human rights tradition. Sure. If it gets lost, and it does get lost from time to time, then of course, the end of human rights, the purpose of human rights comes to an end. That is, a key thing that I keep arguing. And I think we live it quite obviously, both in its positive, in its dynamic, energetic, acting, agentic way, but also in the passive, negative way in which the powers that be want, of course, to keep people out, to keep people away from the ability to defend themselves, and therefore they criminalize resistance, they criminalize dissent, they criminalize protest, as it happened quite extensively, as you know, during the pandemic, where not only public protest was banned in very many places on the grounds of public health reasons, but they moved also at the meta level in France, in the United Kingdom, in Greece, and they also started banning protests altogether or imposing almost impossible conditions. Sure. But the human spirit will come through. And to my mind, there is no stronger, I think, expression of the human spirit than the right of resistance. If human rights protect, promote, give, as you said, tools, critical resources for that resistance, then they're doing their job properly.
Sure. No, I don't disagree, in fact, and I'm very happy you made that connection, because that was exactly the last point I wanted us to address. And I like your sort of semi-Freudian invocation of what's not, of the repressed returning, and you could even say with Freud as well, what is not remembered will be repeated. And I think the remembrance of the legacy of resistance, which I think is a core aspect of what has created and defined the human rights framework, has to be kept vibrant and alive, or else the things will explode in our faces, so to say. So in that sense, I think we're very much on the same page. I would maybe want to interject that there's another question, which is the issue of the degree to which struggle and resistance is bound to be human rights compliant, which is in and of itself a difficult requirement, because it's sometimes experienced as delegitimizing struggle, and that's something we have to be very aware of and very careful about. And at the same time, to legitimize violation and abuse in the name of resistance is also problematic. So I see this as another field of tension that requires very, alert consideration and reflection.
No, I take your point, but I should also say that all revolutions in history and all radical change in history started by being seen as criminal, as being, totally wrong, and was when it was happening, it was being suppressed, and sort of the full power of the law, as it were, was brought upon it. But once victorious, the few occasions in which revolutions won, then of course that whole history changed. The terrorist became a freedom fighter. Remember Mandela, and that kind of event that was seen as totally unacceptable, as indeed sort of sinful at the time of its happening, then is read back anachronistically as part of a long historical tradition that was inevitably leading to its occurrence. And that is the key thing about the point you're making about legitimation and delegitimation. In a sense, the human rights tradition and the law legitimizes certain things, delegitimizes others. But the force of history, the force of the event, if we want to call it that, is something that keeps that idea of resistance on the road. So even if human rights is at one level about courts and lawyers and legal texts and international law and treaties and so on the other hand, it is also part of the tradition that I would call the rights of the street, the rights of the dissident, the rights of the person who has been oppressed or who has been dominated or exploited. And for those people, rights do not mean courts and judges and so on, but when they go out and they say, I want the right to this, I want the right to that, which is given in international law, international treaties, or in my sense of morality and conscience and so on, when they say that, they are also part of the human rights tradition, as any rapporteur of international law and human rights judge.
Sure. Thank you. I think that's absolutely taken on board and agreed. I think we should wrap up now, and I think the discussion at least is a very, very strong reminder for me of how valuable your work is, because it really challenges us. It challenges someone like me and my students to examine our own ideas in a critical perspective and to become at least more articulate. And I think that's a hugely valuable contribution you're making to both education and philosophy, and I appreciate that very much. So, and I would love to continue these discussions, and I'm sure we'll have occasion to do that as well. I'd like to just wrap up by, on behalf of the Global Campus of Human Rights, thanking you so much for joining the podcast, and to also thank all the listeners of the podcast for engaging with us. This is the end of the current podcast series. We're grateful to all of you listeners who have joined us and engaged together with us, and I'm very grateful to my colleagues who have helped the Global Campus branch into this new medium of podcast, and especially the director of the Global Campus e-learning department, Angela Melchiorre. So please stay tuned, and there will be more interesting and challenging podcasts to come from our side.